Hey guys, so I'm a couple days late on this one, but I wanted to say a couple words about the war, liberation, invasion, whatever you want to call it, in Ukraine. And whether or not you agree with Putin's assessment of the situation there doesn't really matter. What matters is that Putin believes what he believes. And you would be hard-pressed to find an even semi-competent Russian or Soviet leader from history who would strongly disagree with him about the strategic importance of Ukraine to Russia's security or the near existential need to keep NATO from absorbing Ukraine. That is the Russian strategic perspective, as acted on by many of Russia's historical strategic leaders from Stalin to Gorbachev, and it's informed by massive, devastating invasions that were launched across Russia's western border. The invasions of Hitler and Napoleon, both of which arrived through the Ukraine. This is not just Putin's perspective. This is the perspective of history. And so ignoring that in favor of labeling Putin a madman and then rapidly expanding NATO outward was an act of provocation by the West. Now, before I go on, please note, I am not necessarily justifying the Ukraine invasion or liberation or whatever you want to call it. People are dying, families are being split apart, and the whole situation is boiling over into a little bit of a humanitarian crisis that would be hard to justify. And I'm not going to pretend that I can see through the fog of war well enough to know exactly what's going on, who's winning, or how much they're winning by. But even if you think Putin is in fact comparable to Hitler, as I've seen said more than once in this latest propaganda craze, it still doesn't get around the fact that with or without Hitler, the Second World War was probably inevitable. Yeah, you didn't think I was going there, did you? But it was. And the Second World War was actually being predicted pretty much from the moment the First World War ended because it was inevitable. It was made inevitable by the Allies. You see, after the First World War, the Allies made the same mistake with Germany as NATO did with Russia at the end of the Cold War. That is to say that they didn't completely annihilate their enemy, but they did claim victory, and then they treated their former rival like a weak and defeated foe, one whose national aspirations were beneath the concerns of the 10% of the world's population represented by the Western powers. You don't have to like Putin to recognize that, to one extent or the other, he is a manifestation of Russia's pursuit of its national interests and its national dignity. And he's never been particularly shy about saying as much. And this isn't Russian propaganda. I'm not a Russian bot or asset. The prediction that the handling of Russia, the eastward expansion of NATO, and the deployment of American ballistic missile systems throughout Eastern Europe would lead to kinetic Russian pushback has come from multiple corners, including from NATO and American leaders themselves. I'm sure, for example, by now you've been exposed to the John Mearsheimer lecture on the topic, where he goes into great detail. Let me remind you.
So nobody should be surprised that the Russians were apoplectic about the idea of us putting Ukraine on the western side of the ledger. And by the way, they told us, I gave you the quotes, in the wake of the Bucharest summit. I told you what happened in August 2008 with the Georgia war. The precedents were there. The rhetoric was there. They told us. But we did not stop our efforts to make Ukraine part of the West. And the Russians responded. Was it surprising? For some reason, President Obama and virtually all of the elites in the West were surprised. I guess this is because they're 21st century people, right? And they think that balance of power politics doesn't matter anymore.
But he's not the only one who's pointed this out over the years. In a 2018 article, America's Foreign Policy Online magazine references an interaction from 1996 between U.S. diplomats Strobe Talbot and Richard Holbrooke. Foreign Policy writes, Talbot warned in an internal memo that an expanded NATO that excludes Russia will not serve to contain Russia's retrograde expansionist impulses. On the contrary, he argued, it will further provoke them. But Richard Holbrooke, then Clinton's special envoy to the Balkans, dismissed this warning. The United States, he wrote in World Policy Journal in 1998, could have its cake and eat it too. Years from now, people will look back at the debate and wonder what all the fuss was about. They will notice that nothing has changed in Russia's relationship with the West. Those words have obviously aged very poorly, and this is the crux of the matter. The arrogance of the Western powers led them to believe that they need never consider another nation's wishes or historical context when creating a world in their own image. In the case of Russia, this behavior has been interpreted as a threat, and not without reason, as foreign policy also writes. The farther east NATO expanded, the more threatening it would become. That seemed especially clear when NATO members began taking unilateral hostile actions against Russia, actions they would never have taken outside of the alliance. In 2015, for example, Turkey shot down a Russian fighter jet that had crossed into its airspace from Syria, where it was bombing opponents of the Bashar al-Assad regime. The Turkish airspace is NATO airspace, the Turkish Foreign Ministry pointedly told Russia after the attack. Russia took notice. Turkey has set up not itself as the actor, but the North Atlantic Alliance, NATO, as a whole, said Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev in an interview with Time magazine. This is extremely irresponsible. And he was right. It was irresponsible, not only of Turkey, but of NATO, who only permitted Turkey's entry to the organization in the first place as a geostrategic counterweight to Russia. And so, Russia, a historical great power, finds itself isolated and agitated against by former foes who insist, in the form of NATO, on closing in on her borders with weapon systems that gradually reduce her ability to deter potential Western aggression against her territory. And with Ukraine being the last point of potential Western aggression that had not yet been secured, it was obvious that the country would be the target of Russian ire. And yet, NATO, despite making it a target through agitation of Russia, basically sat out of reach and waited for Russia to take the bait, turning Ukraine into a devastated casualty zone that the Western powers could make even more calamitous by flooding the country with weapons, and using the whole event as an excuse to try and destroy the Russian economy, something that will have unavoidable, massive global repercussions, but that will allow the US to cement its hegemony into the East. Now look, as I've already said, I'm not trying to tell anyone to like Putin or to support this war. But the Western powers' hands are not clean. If they had secured Ukraine while sincerely and openly negotiating with Russia, or even acknowledged that the countries have a unique history that the West doesn't quite understand, then they might not now have a war on their eastern borders. It's important that it be remembered and made note of that a centralized authority that can exert power from a great distance and that is unaccountable to the people of the world, even via their national representatives, is at best useless and at worst dangerous, even if its intent is good. NATO, and the WEF for that matter, are examples of such organizations. Now, apparently, Russian and Ukraine leaders are sitting down to talk peace. I've heard that a couple of times. So let's hope that that's not just used as an excuse to prolong hostilities and that a mutually beneficial arrangement can be arrived at. Otherwise, shit's just going to get worse. Anyway, guys, that's my 10 cents on that situation. I hope you enjoyed. If you agree or if you don't, comment below. Hit like, hit subscribe, and I will catch you later. Cheers.